Hello everyone, it is Joe here from Omnipoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon. If you're looking for PTCGO codes, including the stuff from Chilling Reign, make sure you go ahead and check out the Potown store. You can get a 5% discount on your order using that code Omnipoke. For today's video, we are going to be going over the impact of rotation. Now, Jack's already done a really good, concise video of the sort of top 10 cards that we are going to be missing and how that adapts the format. But today, we're going to be niching down into each specific archetype and how they are going to be changing post-rotation. And also be looking at Evolving Skies now that we have done a set review. Check it out if you haven't watched it yet. So we can be looking at what these cards gain as well as what they lose. So give us a real good full picture of how these decks will be performing and how the archetypes will look in the new format. So let's first look at the top contenders of the format currently. This is the team up onto Chilling Reign format, and really on the left-hand side of the screen, these are the really top performing archetypes, I would say, and on the right, they are some of the less well-performing, but still have had a few results here and there. And these are going to be the decks that really we're going to be spotlighting today and talking about, and how they're going to be adapting, if at all, if they may even just be rotating completely. And then what we're left with, really, is going to be the idea here. So rotation's a big deal. Obviously, we're losing Team Up and all the way up to Cosmic Eclipse, leaving us with Sword and Shield on. There's more cards than this that we are losing, of course, but these are some of the most relevant today, I would say, cards that still see play in certain archetypes. Pikarom is obviously a big one going ADP, a really huge GX that has seen a lot of play throughout its time in Standard. I think the bottom cards here are some of the biggest ones, though, for just general gameplay. Losing to Dene GX, a really big consistency piece that pretty much every deck could use. Same thing for Stellar Wish. Oricoro found its way into a ton of different archetypes and was really good for one prize archetypes in particular. Mewtwo, we do have Eldegoss still in the format, but that's a small loss there. Swell and Marshadow, this is now a massive one. The Stadium War is back, and Path of the Peak becomes a much scarier card going forward, so that's something that we'll talk about throughout in terms of how it impacts certain decks going forward. Mew is another absolutely huge one, because we have a lot of good sniping in the format. We have Urshifu, we have Zeraora, we have the new Jolteon coming out. Lots of things can put good sniping pressure around the board, and now we have no answer to that. Your opponent is free to do whatever they want to your bench in terms of damage, and you really can't stop that. So Mew is going to be a huge loss. Reset Stamp is another one, and this is the only, in air quotes, comeback mechanic that we have in the game right now, and it means that we are left with no comeback mechanic whatsoever. Our only real valid form of hand disruption at all is from Marnie, and that gives the opponent 4 cards to work with, which isn't a huge amount, but they can still easily find their outs in the later stages if they only need an energy here or there, or a boss's orders, that sort of thing. We can't really deny that from the opponent anymore, so going forward into the new format, it feels like get ahead, stay ahead is pretty much going to be the game plan of a lot of these archetypes, with no real way for you to claw back in the game. And then Communication is one that pretty much every deck loses across the board. It's a really nice option to give yourself extra turn 1 plays, as well as being that flexible out to get yourself evolutions in the later stages. Of course, we have a lot of good ball search already. We do have Quick Ball, we do have Evo Incense, we do have things like Capture Energy and Great Ball to sort of fill those gaps as well. But Communication was one of those cards that just fit in there rather than maxing out copies of these other cards, because it was that flexible in-between of helping you get that turn 1 Pokemon down into play, etc. And I think we will feel the pain of that just that little bit. Outside of that, there's all sorts here, other archetypes going. Control seems to be completely gutted. The entire top right of your screen is basically control tools, and that's going. The Tag Call package was a really nice one to see, but we'll get into the nitty-gritty of how individual decks cope post-rotation. And really, that means that we can straight away shortlist this a little bit more. We are losing Lucario Melmetal, we are losing ADP, which then takes 2 archetypes out of the pool. Dark Box and Malamar VMAX, although we keep Malamar itself, we lose all the acceleration that Malamar would use via the Weavile and Red and Blue package. Spiritomb rotates. Rillaboom is still in the format, but Eggrow goes, and that is really the way that you got into Rillaboom in most situations. Now it's just a rare candy deck, which is just not that ideal, and we lose a lot of those support Pokemon that Rillaboom would use, which is either Rowegg or Mewtwo and Toolbox attackers. Now we're basically left to use like regular V Pokemon to attack with, and there aren't that many good ones. Maybe things like Delmai's VMAX, but that also seems awkward because it's not doing well at all at the moment. Pikarom finally is waving goodbye. It's been around for a long time, but it's finally going. We've lost Catterday, which has recently had a few highlight performances, and Tempozard is finally going, leaving us with this much shorter list of mostly VMAX decks, to be honest. There are still a couple of one prizes in here with the Rapid Strike Malamar and the Decidueye. But yeah, other than that, it's pretty much just VMAX decks. So yeah, that's what we're left with, and that's how the format will be shaping up. So then, if you haven't already seen the set review, here's a real quick primer for you. A few new cards that we are getting from Evolving Skies. Just pause now if you really want to, but you can get the full in-depth knowledge of all of these cards via the set review. It is a long one, of course, but it will really put you in good stead for knowing what's going to be what in the new format. So now let's look back at our surviving decks and see how they are going to be changing going forward. Calyrex does lose Horror House, and I think Horror House is a really, really big card for this deck. I've played a lot of Shadow Rider since its release. It's been the deck that I've mained in this format, so I've got really in-depth knowledge of this deck and how it functions. Horror House was an excellent way for you to just buy time, and time allows you to get into your VMAXs unopposed, and it allows you to spread energy all around your board, and it really meant that Max Geist was actually a good enough main attack in the deck, and you didn't even need many backup Pokemon in a lot of situations. Now, we have seen Alcremie has become more successful as the format's come on, as a 1-1 count sometimes, but I can see that going higher in the post-rotation format, because we don't have Horror House anymore. We don't have the freedom of just spamming Max Geist for an entire turn before your opponent can answer you. So now we need that damage ramp to be a little bit more fast, and I think Alcremie may be the card to do that. The other alternative is having your Aurora box style approach and have a couple Necrozma V probably, and maybe some Zapdos V in there as well, to be your 2-prize Pokemon, and you just use Ghost Rider as a accelerator, essentially, whilst also drawing your cards. So that could be something. The other option is the new include of the Galarian Articuno. When you pop it into play, you can attach 2 Psychic Energy immediately from your hand onto this card. So that could be a way that you could essentially buff your damage by 60 for Ghost Rider. So I could foresee straight Psychic builds still being a thing for sure. The other issue now is that we have way less good answers to Path to the Peak. We lose Marshadow, which was an excellent way that you could just have it sat on board, knowing that you can bounce your opponent's stadium whenever you want to. That goes, and we also lose Swell, which was kind of the other big stadium that Shadow Rider often played. Now we're pretty much stuck with Training Court, which isn't bad. It does have good synergy with Shadow Rider anyway, just for gaining attachments and continuing to draw cards, but it doesn't have that same immediate effect of defending against the Path to the Peak, which isn't as good. We do still have a ball searchable out to Bouncing Stadium in the new Pumpkaboo, but it's way less effective. You may even need to commit spaces to things like Scoop Up Net if you want to get multiple uses of this card, which doesn't sound quite as clean as Marshadow, and oftentimes will take up more spaces. So I think in general the core of Shadow Rider is still here. I think we know ways to adapt, which is either going down a 2-prize V route or going down a heavy Psychic route with Alcremie and Articuno to really ramp and burst that damage output. I think that's really how it's going to go. It certainly feels a lot more fair in this format than it currently does, because Horror House is just a very, very, very good attack for this archetype in particular, and would allow you to have a lot of turns and steal games all over the place. So you will feel the loss, but it still seems like a very strong archetype. Next up, we have Eternatus. We lose a couple of nice tech bench Pokemon. Free Retreat Pivot from Yveltal is quite awkward, and Weavile has snuck into certain lists ever since Galarian Moltres came out, which is okay. I think just like Shadow Rider, we're more concerned about Path to the Peak going forward, because Eternatus can't really use any good stadium to any good effect. I think Training Court is like pretty much the best synergy card we could have, maybe something like a Fashion Mall. These are both pretty bad stadiums, and you don't really want to commit deck space to these cards that do basically nothing for you out of fear of Path. But you really need to respect Path to the Peak, because it really limits your damage output. Of course, it shuts off your Eternatus VMAX's ability to have 8 bench Pokemon, so it forces you to discard Pokemon, which is never nice. So finding a way around that is going to be, I think, Eternatus's biggest challenge. One way that I've thought about doing this is incorporating the Umbreon VMAX package, and the Umbreons themselves are single strike Pokemon, because then you can use Tower of Darkness to potentially allow yourself to have additional draws throughout the game. You'd only have like 10 or so cards that are valid to discard, including the towers themselves, but it would act as a good way to deal with Path whilst also drawing cards and also having gusting pressure, which I think is something that is valid. Now, this Umbreon package may not outweigh the power of Moltres and E-Switch, which I think are the spaces I'd have to take out to make room in the Eternatus deck, especially if hammers are still a thing. So maybe there's still going to be a straightforward Eternatus with Moltres and E-Switches. I've even tried builds of Eternatus going back to Crushing Hammer, because hammers do seem quite strong next format. It's a sad state of affairs, but hammer is looking like a good card again in the format. We've had a little bit of respite in Chilling Reign, but it does seem to be once again a strong option for decks going forward, especially because, like I've already mentioned, we don't have Stamp anymore. So hammers may be the only way for you to claw back board position after your opponent essentially either takes the first prize or puts the first amount of damage into play into your evolving V Pokemon. There's not much you can do about that. Outside of having hammers to claw your way back into board positions and maybe alongside Marnie make them have certain combo pieces that they could whiff, and that's a sad state of affairs, really. Onto Rapid Strike Urshifu. I think a lot of people are terrified of this archetype going forward because Mew rotates, and that means that Rapid Flow is extremely dangerous and your opponent can't stop you from using Gmax Rapid Flow, which is really, really solid. And I think that is the big selling point of Rapid Strike going ahead. We know that Rapid Strike is pretty much at the top of the meta at the moment already, you know, in that high tier 1 echelon. It's just won the Players' Cup 4. So definitely a lot of people are looking towards this archetype alongside the Inteleons. So that looks very good. One thing I will say is that you do lose Karate Belt, so spamming Gmax Rapid Flow isn't quite as easy, which is obviously a good thing for us. And we are losing Hooper as a one-prize dark colorless attacker, which could be used against Shadow Rider, as well as Jirachi GX, which could also be used against Shadow Rider effectively to make it that little bit less easy for your opponent to just overwhelm you with Max Geist. So losing both of those things is going to be awkward. I think possibly something like Moltres E-Switch could be worked into the deck, even if it is just a low count of both of these sorts of cards, and maybe just like 4 Dark Energy, something like that. I think that could be filling the void if you are concerned about Shadow Rider and if it remains on top. The other alternative is, of course, just to remain straightforward as you are right now, just with Intels, and maybe even working in the new Raihan supporter as a one-of to give yourself 1 turn of burst acceleration to get a second Rapid Flow out of nowhere. And there's also the really cool Metacham card, which I think is very good. Yoga Loop buying you an extra turn can allow you to claw back victories out of nowhere. So I think this is definitely going to be a worthy one-of include in Rapid Strike going ahead. Next up, we have Ice Rider. I think on paper, this is the biggest winner for me. I think it loses basically nothing. Dedenne is a little bit of a harsh loss because it helped you have extra discard synergy for water energy to allow yourself Melanie more often. But outside of that, you're not worried at all. You actually gain a lot of good cards. Suicune being an excellent V Pokemon, just a 2-prizer that can put a lot of pressure into play. It draws you cards. It opens up the Altaria engine for you, which then allows you to cherry pick Melanie to the top and means that you can chain that much more often, so you can aggressively use your Ice Rider in a lot more situations, because you can be constantly spamming your discard for the full 250, knowing that Altaria can get Melanie straight back for the following turn. And there's the option of you having Umbreon VMAX in the deck, even if it is just, again, a low count, because you can hit 250 turn 2, bossing up something, or using Umbreon to gust up their evolving V Pokemon and knock them out before they are able to evolve, makes this a very dangerous archetype, I think. So there will be different strands of Ice Rider, I'm pretty certain. There may be some Cincino Altaria, like Suicune lists. There may be some Inteleon lists, like we're seeing currently. And there could even be lists that are playing Umbreon. And, you know, probably a combination of all of those sorts of cards as well in different, like, counts. So I think there's lots of ways Ice Rider could be very strong next format. I think it seems really, really good. The one thing I will say is that the Metal weakness will still be awkward. I can still foresee Zacian seeing play, even though ADP and Luke Metal both rotate. I still think there will be Zacian decks, and I still think Zamazenta could be a tanking deck in its own rights, just with the new Stadium and Rusted Shield. So I don't think we're completely in the clear. I do think your weakness will still be relevant. But I think, in general, this gains a ton of cards and loses very niche pieces that you could survive without anyway. So I think Ice Rider is looking very strong post-rotation and probably climbing that tier list to the higher echelons of tier 1, I would say. On to Decidueye. Decidueye loses a few bits here and there. Malolana was nice for healing, so you could outlast some other 1v1 prize decks. and just stop your opponent just getting poke damage on you or sprinkle damage with placing counters and that sort of stuff. But not really a huge deal. Jirachi you can live without as well. Oftentimes people move to Snorlax anyway. So yeah, you can really cope with all this sort of stuff going. You're not too concerned about any of that. I think Raihan, again, could be a nice include. We have seen Rosa in the past in Decidueye in like a 2-count. Raihan could certainly do the same thing because it does allow you to help fight other one-prize decks that little bit better because you can actually maintain your 2 energy attack even if they are knocking you out turn by turn, which I think is pretty important. The one thing I will say is that Decidueye may get caught in the crossfire of the new Glaceon VMAX and how hyped that gets. Glaceon VMAX is just the same as Zamazenta, really, with that ability that shuts off VMAXs from damaging it. So if Glaceon and Zamazenta do see play, I can easily foresee Phoebe and Eldegoss entering into these other VMAX decks, and then in turn it makes Decidueye that little bit weaker. I'm not saying it's like unplayable, but you should expect decks to either be playing ways around Glaceon, Zamazenta, or Decidueye, or just playing Phoebe and blasting through you. So I don't think you're completely in the clear, but I think it's as it was, really, where you're going to pick your moments to play Decidueye in tournaments when your opponents, or when the general meta isn't too concerned about these sorts of walling decks. But we are getting so many of these. Even arguably the Duraludon is a similar card where people may play Phoebe just to get through it. There's just so many of these now that it actually cannibalizes each other because they become more on the radar in general, which means people actually tech for them. So it may be that tipping point that's just too much for Decidueye in general. Onto Rapid Strike Malamar. It does lose a couple big pieces. I think Oricorio is a massive loss. 3 free cards every turn for a deck that is starving for hand size pretty much every turn because you shuffle so many back into your deck to deal damage in the first place. Your goal every single turn is to reestablish your next attacker, but also commit a ton of cards towards building that hand size as much as possible. So I think that will be a little bit awkward for Rapid Strike Mally. Rescue Trolley may be a decent card here because it could allow you to have easier times of using things like Cincino, because you can just Cincino away things like Inkays and then trolley them straight back. Or when things are getting knocked out naturally, you can trolley and then it's a 1 card for 80 damage, which isn't too shabby. Zinnia's Resolve could also be decent because it's another one of these supporters that helps you grow that hand size. It does force a couple discards, but hopefully it's not too painful for you. So yeah, I think you lose a lot of tempo with Rapid Mally. You lose that little bit of bounce back, which I think is a little bit awkward. But 1 prizes are at least happy to see ADP going, right? Same thing for Decidueye. You're much happier playing in a field where ADP is no longer an option because they can't just GX attack, and you just like never have enough damage to win the game. So that's a little thing going for 1 prizes, and I do have my eye out for 1 prize decks. I'm not sure that Malamar is going to be the best one going ahead, but I do think there is the window open for a couple 1 prizes to actually see play in the format, so let's keep an eye on that. Victini is a super interesting one as well now. It loses a ton of cards. I've basically played every single one of the cards that's on the slide here in Victini. And yeah, you really get gutted. All of the fire support that came out in Unbroken Bonds and Unified Minds is finally going. So that means Victini is just out there fighting on his own. The good news is that with every GX Pokemon leaving the format, Victini now hits everything for 220, essentially. So its damage output just in general becomes much harder to counter for the opponent, and you're just happy doing 220 in pretty much every situation. So this now becomes a very low maintenance, easy to run deck that your opponent can't really answer too easily. They're just accepting the fact that you're getting punched for 220 every turn. This also has colorless in its attack cost, so you're able to play things like Capture Energy, which then really opens up an Umbreon engine, which I think is extremely dangerous. Just like I said with Ice Rider, this time with Victini it's even more so the case because you have those captures to fall back on. A turn 2 Umbreon Gust KO is going to be extremely dangerous for Umbreon, and I think that's going to put it in that higher tier echelon, even with Ice Rider being an archetype. I do think this is good enough to compete, even with that sort of downside. I could also see an Aurora Box style Victini deck be functional, because you just have stable damage, but also then these Aurora style attackers that can give you different type coverages, like Zapdos, Galarian Moltres, those sorts of things that we've seen in the past, possibly even Suicune in this list for mirror match situations. And there's even an even more out-the-box style deck, which is where you're going to try and play similar to old Tempozard, where you play like 18, 19, 20 energies perhaps, and have Volcarona as a finisher. because it has the same attack essentially as the Victini Prism Star. So your mini goal the entire game is to be using Make Do, Research, and Zinnia, these sorts of effects to discard all of your fires as you go, and then a one attachment Surging Flames can be a 320 sort of damage burst for a huge knockout. So there's a ton of different directions I can see Victini being successful. I think I'm most afraid of coming up against an Umbreon one, because whenever that deck goes first, it will have a very high win rate, just because Gust turn 2 KO the V that your opponent is building up is such a powerful effect in this format. So these are all things that I'm concerned about for Victini. Raihan potentially is the only supporter acceleration that we can play. The other alternative is Melanie, and sort of having a mix and match of water and fire energies with like a Suicune package. All of these are options for Victini because it's just low to the ground, easy to use, and now your opponent has no real Pokemon that they can throw in the face of this card to tank. It's just in generally a very strong effect. Blissey is an interesting one. It's more of a fun deck anyway, really, to be honest. It's this quad style build where you try and make some very chunky Blisseys with 300 hit points thanks to the toughness cape, and then you just try and shove hammers and paths in your opponent's direction. But I do think that's okay. Hammer, like I said, is looking stronger this set, this rotation. Fan of Wave seems like a really strong card as well. I'm trying to put Capture in as many decks as possible, and that means that in turn Fan of Waves is going to be good tempo removal. The one thing I will say is that you lose the tanking of Malolana to undo a ton of damage. And you also don't have Weakness Guard energy, so you are very, very vulnerable to Zapdos and Urshifu. So that makes this deck probably a lot less viable. But in general, you can still cheese those wins by just dropping Path and dropping Hammers in those opening turns and growing a Blissey too big for your opponent to deal with. I think it'll be rare, but it'll just be that fun niche deck, really. Onto Dragapult. This is quite an interesting one. The fact that we're moving more and more into VMAX territory makes this damage output that much worse. I think you become extremely reliant on things like Horror Psychic Energy to keep your damage output decent. So that is a big concern for me. The one thing I will say is, again, you get to play a lot of consistency cards and you're low maintenance. You're just a 2 energy attachment deck. You have Fog Crystal and you have Quick Ball, so you get your Dragapult out turn 1 very often. You get attacking turn 2 quite often, so it has a similar feel to Ice Rider and Victini, where just 2 energy, you're doing what you want to do. And you actually have the space to play Hammers and Path to the Peak, so this could again be that annoying deck that buys a turn from the opponent just from you flipping 1 or 2 heads, or the stadium just sticking for a turn and your opponent can't Crobat or they can't execute their strategy. The good news is for Dragapult as well is that Path is harder to deal with for Eternatus, so you might actually be able to tank a hit from Eterna now, which would be extremely surprising. But I also think potentially a levelable engine could be nice for Draga, where you play Cincino, Altaria, and the Altaria can Luring Search into annoying supporters in general, or give yourself the option to play Raihan, which then allows you to have attachment for turn plus Raihan to actually bounce back a Dragapult out of nowhere if your first one goes down quickly. So I think these are all decent options for Dragapult. I think it won't be a super high tier deck, but it can be one of the most annoying straightforward decks in the game. So that's something to bear in mind because it will be very low maintenance. Blaziken Zeraora is an interesting one. You like to see Mew go because Zeraora can take advantage of its sniping. The one thing I will say is that potentially this is just warping into more of a Sylveon-focused deck, and then you play Blaziken and maybe like one Zeraora in that sort of list, because Sylveon is trying to play a type coverage style box here, and having the type coverage of Blaziken would be beneficial, and giving you some energy recovery is always fine. I can foresee that being more so the case than how we see it now, which is very heavily focused on Blaziken and Zeraora is your only backup attacker. I think we've found that that's quite weak to things like boss's orders and stuff like that. Your low tempo from Blaziken because it's only 130 damage that you're dealing. So if we are going to see a straight Blazaura working in the format, it's probably because we've found the ways for Zacian to still be one of the strongest decks in the game, despite ADP and Luke Metal going. But I think more likely we'll be seeing a Sylveon Rapid Strike box style deck coming out of this set, and I think that's how this deck will be warping in future. Single Strike is also a super interesting one. It loses only a couple of pieces because most of its cards are all inter-synergistic cards, so your deck is different to how most decks are built anyway. You'd basically just play Dedennes, and other than that, you're just keeping everything else because it was all Single Strike cards, which is really good for you. And I think Umbreon is you know, I've gushed about it already so much. I think it's a ridiculously good card, and such a good card that it will probably be the face of Single Strike as well going forward. You get to play Piers, which then gives you great search for Houndour, Houndoom, Umbreon, and Umbreon VMAX, so your engine and your main attacker can all be searched out. And at the same time, you have colorless attack cost in your Umbreon so much that you can play a high capture energy count, which again, in turn, helps you get even more setup going. So I think you're going to have a really easy time at getting multiple Houndooms into play, much more easy than currently, which is one of the big downsides of Single Strike right now, is that you're very reliant on hitting multiple Houndours turn 1. So this will really help smooth that transition. You also gain good bench control, which I think Single Strike never currently really does at the moment, because you're so often using Research and Marnie just to go ahead and find your next Urn, your next Houndoom, your next attacker, that sort of thing. So having inbuilt Gust from your abilities is going to be fantastic for you, while you can maintain using these other draw supporters or Piers itself. So that's going to be really nice. You gain some nice type coverage. You have this Dark type in Umbreon now, which is far easier to use than Tyranitar because it's one less energy attachment, and it's good, you know, in general. And even the regular V can knock out Shadow Riders, so you can still have a 2-prizer doing up trades on 3-prizers if need be. But you can still play the fighting element in this deck and just have 1 or 2 copies of the Single Strike Urshifu to have the fighting type coverage against Eternatus. So that's something to bear in mind. I also think that Tower of Darkness is a really, really strong stadium card, and we've not really seen it scratch the surface and how good it can be. But now that we have Swell and Marshadow rotating, you're actually going to see just how strong this stadium is. It gives this deck a natural bounce to path, and it means that you can just draw additional cards throughout the game very, very often. And that's just really good. It gives this deck internal consistency and even turn 1 consistency to help you get turn 1, you know, plays down, extra Houndours, and getting your ideal Pokemon into play, whether it's Urshifu or whether it's Umbreon, as quickly as possible. So that stadium is actually low-key cracked. It's super good. It's like way better than Scorched Earth back in the day because you have way more outs to it. So we'll actually start seeing how strong that stadium is. So I'm very excited for Single Strike. I think it's been around tier 3 right now, and I think it can easily be jumping up into tier 2 status, depending on how strong Leafeon VMAX gets, because that could be an awkward weakness for Umbreon to take if that archetype does actually kick on. And that's really what we're getting to now, as we've talked about all the archetypes that are remaining in the format and how they're going to be adapting and changing what new cards can come in and out. But potentially there are completely new archetypes on the block thanks to Evolving Skies. So obviously Rayquaza is one of the big poster boys. That's certainly looking like a reasonable archetype. I've mentioned Glaceon when talking about the Decidueye deck, and I think this also has a ton of potential because it is a very high hit point walling Pokemon, and pretty much every surviving deck in the format is going to be a VMAX, so you wall basically every deck in the format, which is very difficult to deal with. Outside of that, other brand new archetypes, there's also a potential 1-prize Flaffy deck going on where you use Regieleki and a few other Pokemon like Zapdos to do some spread damage and take up trades there. There's potential for Cherim to have a new partner from Regidrago, which is an interesting 1-prize archetype, potentially glued together by a new Eldegoss card. The Leafeon VMAX also looks to have a lot of promising elements to it. You can be a low maintenance 2-energy attacker. The regular V gives you inbuilt energy acceleration in the early turns, so you can safeguard around hammers. You can safeguard around going second and getting one of your Pokemon bossed up, because you can put energy on 2 separate Pokemon, which is nice. Galamine is, in general, is going to be awkward for your opponent to deal with because Air Balloon is such a big card in a lot of these archetypes. So there's a lot to like about the Leafeon in general. Grass Knot can do very reasonable damage, especially because of how much I think Umbreon is going to change the game. I think having weakness on Umbreon and punishing that is going to be a really big deal. So yeah, I think Leafeon has a ton of potential. Some sort of new and adapting decks. I think Zamazenta will move into this sort of Rusted Shield quad build where you just say, can you beat 3 of these 300 hit point 2 prizes with the annoying wall Dauntless Shield text, and you're going to play probably a very high count of the new Stadium card, which is essentially a Rough Seas for metal types, where you can heal 30 between turns. So just moving in and out of Zamazentas, taking hits and healing them, forcing your opponent to boss every single turn, or you're just going to get further and further out of range. Sounds very difficult to deal with. Zacian could have a new couple of partners here. I think Jolteon is a potential one because Brave Blade doing 230, and then Thunderclap doing 100 to finish off things, whilst also setting up a bench Pokemon for a future Brave Blade. Sounds like a really good partnership, especially because Jolteon has built-in free retreat, so it allows you to reset Brave Blade quite easily. Even the regular V has free retreat, so that's certainly something to bear in mind. The other alternative that myself and Jack has played quite a bit, actually, is Inteleon's SWSH-on, where we have the Rusted Sword in here, we go up to 260, we have Leon, and we have Quick Shooting for potential ways to actually one-shot VMAXs, which is kind of scary, especially because you just naturally have inbuilt tempo from Brave Blade on turn 2, with Drizzile allowing you to boss KO V Pokemon, which I've said a few times is a really good way to just win games in this new format going forward. So that's internally quite a good deck that me and Jack both expect to be a strong Zacian variant. Suicune on its own doesn't necessarily have to go alongside Ice Rider. It could be part of a type coverage toolbox, because I do think the Galarian, Moltres, and Zapdos do need a new home now that ADP have gone. But I think this could certainly be a new flagship way. And finally, there's a Wailord Frostmoth, which I'll be actually profiling on the channel soon. I think we have some gameplay of this. Really, the idea is that Wailord is a super chunky 2-prize Pokemon, so it is not too concerned about going second, because firstly you have the draw up attack, which can benefit from you going second, and secondly you're not going to get boss KO'd, so you can actually plant your energies onto something and be safe in that regard. And there's no swell anymore, so you can stick Glimwood Tangle in play for Ocean Waves to have that cheese factor of getting a one-hit KO throughout one game, and sometimes that's enough to be a win condition. And you also have Suicune as a backup attacker for if Frostmoth is targeted. You still have a 2-energy Pokemon that you can swing with. So Wailord actually looks like a lot less of a meme than it was previously, which is kind of funny, especially with Lightning types getting less strong. The Rayquaza is probably the flagship Lightning Pokemon. Potentially Jolteon as well, but even that can't one-shot Wailord. So yeah, I think these are some interesting new contenders. Let me know if you have any other new contenders that you think is going to be strong in the format that isn't on the slide here, or isn't one of the decks that we've mentioned already. Myself and Jack have put a lot of testing into this format, and hopefully you've seen from the set review and stuff that we are, really hot on this set, and we're really looking towards post-rotation with a lot of interest, and we're trying to leave no stone unturned with a lot of decks potentially in the mix. So I hope you did enjoy this video. I hope you're looking forward to rotation, because it's just a month away now. So yeah, let me know your thoughts. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in another video tomorrow. Cheers.